This is Auntie Fran with a story for you from my wonderful gift book of fairy tales. And that story is Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. As you can see, this book is very well loved. There were once two brothers living in the land of Persia. The older one, Qasim, had married a wealthy woman and become a man of substance. Ali Baba, the younger one, had married a girl as poor as himself and became a humble woodcutter. Qasim dwelt in a large house, employed many servants, and looked down his nose at Ali Baba, whose house was very tiny and had a leaky roof. Ali Baba was quite resigned to the fact that he would never be a rich man, just as his brother devoutly hoped that he would never become a poor one. Life often has surprises in store when one least expects them, and so it was that Ali Baba, while chopping wood in the forest, was quite unprepared for what was about to happen. As he worked, Ali Baba hummed a tune to himself. Soon he found that he had to hum very loudly because there was a lot of noise going on. He stopped to try to identify the sound. It was the pounding of hooves, and they were approaching the spot where Ali Baba stood. Being a cautious man, Ali Baba made himself scarce. He hid behind a large rock and peered out to see who was coming. A band of horsemen was riding toward him. Their leader was a tall, dark man. When the riders were close enough for Ali Baba to see their faces, he saw that this man looked ruthless and frightening. The riders were nearing some rocks. From his place of concealment, Ali Baba saw them rein their horses and the leader rise up in his saddle. He pointed at the rock and in a commanding voice shouted, "Open sesame!" What followed now was almost too incredible for Ali Baba to believe, even though he saw it with his own eyes. There was a great rumbling and trembling, and slowly an opening appeared where previously there had been none. The horsemen rode in and the cave closed up. There was no sign of any door. Ali Baba was too terrified to move. He stood trembling and waiting to see what would happen next. Quite soon he heard the same sound as before and saw the horsemen emerge through the opening, which again, as if by magic, had appeared. This time Ali Baba counted the men. There were 40 of them. As they issued from the cave, he saw that their saddlebags were now empty. They must be robbers hiding their treasure, thought Ali Baba, and hid further behind the rock. They will surely cut my throat if they realize that I have discovered their hiding place. When the robbers had gone, Ali Baba began to run home. As he ran, he thought about what he had witnessed. He slowed down, then he stopped. I wonder, he thought, what would happen if I tried to get into the cave? Probably it would not open for me at all, but if it did. Quickly he turned back the way he had come and stopped at the spot where he had seen the robber chief rein his horse. He took a deep breath. "Open sesame!" he roared at the top of his voice. Nothing happened. Ali Baba sadly turned away. "Oh well," he said. Just then there was a great crescendo of sound as the cave opened. Ali Baba laughed with delight and hurried in. The great door in the rock shut behind him, and Ali Baba was confronted by a sight such as his eyes had never seen before. The whole cave blazed with shimmering light. The floor was strewn with exotic treasure. Precious stones lay in heaps among goblets of gold and vases of crystal. Sacks overflowed with necklaces and rings of the finest workmanship. Ali Baba stood for a moment as if turned to stone and gasped at the dazzling sight. Then he began to fill his pockets with as much treasure as they would hold. He was very careful to take only one thing from each pile so that the robbers would not suspect that someone had found their hoard. Soon he could carry no more, and without delay he returned to the spot where the door had been. Again, Ali Baba spoke the words of power. "Open sesame!" This time, without any delay, he was able to walk out of the fantastic cave. This time he did hurry home to his wife. At first, she did not believe her husband and scolded him for getting drunk and imagining things. But when he showed her the jewels concealed in his pockets, she realized that he must be speaking the truth. After supper, Ali Baba and his wife sat down to count their money and jewels. Neither of them had possessed anything much worth counting in the past, so they were not very good at it. Finally, Ali Baba's wife gave up. "I know what I shall do," she said. "I will borrow a measuring cup from your brother Kasim's wife, and we can see how much treasure we have without all this trouble." Off she went without delay. The wife of Kasim knew that Ali Baba was penniless and wondered what her sister-in-law could possibly want with a measuring cup. Being of an inquisitive disposition, she determined to find out. "Of course you may borrow my measuring cup," she said. "I will just fetch it from my husband's storeroom for you." Before she gave the cup to Ali Baba's wife, she decided to put a small patch of thick glue at the bottom of the vessel. Anything that was measured in the cup would then stick to this, and the secret would be out. Ali Baba's wife accepted the cup gratefully, and not suspecting anything, took it home. Immediately, Ali Baba began to fill it from the small pile of jewels which lay in front of him on the floor. It was much easier to count them by the cupful, and the work was soon completed. Ali Baba sent his wife to return the cup. Neither of them had any idea that inside it, stuck to the glue, was a bright, shiny gold coin. When Kasim's wife saw the coin in the cup, she hurried to her husband and began to nag him. "Kasim, you must go straight to the house of that awful brother of yours and find out where this money has come from. Why, he never possessed 2 pennies to rub together." Kasim looked at the coin she held in her hand. He had never seen gold of such high quality. Surely, if his brother had a secret source of wealth, it was only right that he should share it with his nearest relative. It was too late to do anything about it that night, but Kasim determined that early next morning he would discover from Ali Baba the source of his wealth. As soon as he awoke the next day, Kasim set off to his brother's house. It was so early that Ali Baba was still asleep, but his wife invited Kasim in to wait while she woke her husband. Kasim sat in the tiny kitchen and looked around him. He noticed that above the fireplace, some of the bricks appeared to be coming loose. He decided to take a closer look. He put his hand on the edge of one of the bricks to push it into place, but it fell right out as he touched it. In the cavity behind it, Cassim was astonished to see something glittering. Unable to restrain his curiosity, he slipped in his hand to feel what it was and pulled out a handful of beautiful gems. Cassim could hardly believe his own eyes. He was just about to slip his hand into the hole in the wall again when Ali Baba entered the room. Cassim felt rather embarrassed at being caught prying, so he began to shout. "What kind of brother do you think you are, keeping secrets from one who loves you so dearly as I? I suppose that you had no intention of sharing your good fortune with anyone as humble as myself. Probably I am not good enough for you now that you are so rich." Ali Baba was quite amazed at his brother's outburst. He began to feel that perhaps he had treated his brother unfairly by not telling him. He decided to remedy this straight away, just as Cassim thought he would. Cassim was very eager to hear all that Ali Baba had to say. As soon as he heard about the hoard of treasure, he felt that nothing would suffice but that he should increase his own wealth by depriving the robbers of some of theirs. "They are only thieves," he said to Ali Baba. "Just as they have deprived innocent folk, so I shall deprive them." He hurried home to prepare his pack mules, and as soon as they were made ready with large baskets to contain the treasure, he set off along the road Ali Baba had described. It did not take Cassim long to reach the spot at which the cave opened. He took a piece of parchment out of his pocket and in a brave voice read out the words upon it. "Open, Sesame!" At once, the cave entrance appeared with a great rumble. Cassim threw away the parchment and strode in, leading his pack of animals. He did not stop to admire the magnificence spread before him. Greedily and swiftly he filled the panniers which the mules had on their backs. Suddenly Cassim heard the sound of movement outside the cave. He realized that the robbers must be about to enter. As fast as he could, he led the animals further into the cave in search of concealment. "Open, Sesame!" roared the robber chief. He and his men rode into the cave, dismounted, and tethered their horses. They began to unload the baskets they carried. One of the men gave a shout. "Mahmoud, someone has been here. I am sure that there was more in this sack than there is now. I should know as I brought it myself." All the thieves gathered around the speaker and waited to hear what their chief would say. After looking around, Mahmoud spoke softly. "Quietly, men. Let us search every corner of the cave. The villain may still be concealed here. The man who finds him may have the pleasure of slitting his throat." The men dispersed, and in no time at all, Cassim was found. Before he could even beg for mercy, he was dead, and his head was cut off. The robbers thought it was a fair revenge for his crime, stealing from them. They left his body where it lay and went on their way. By that evening, Cassim's wife was beginning to be worried about her husband. Never had he stayed away from home for so long. She begged Ali Baba to go and find out what had become of him. Ali Baba did not really want to return to the cave, but he felt obligated to help his sister-in-law. What a sight met his eyes when he entered the cave. There lay the dead body of his brother Cassim. With a heavy heart, Ali Baba turned homeward. He did not know how he was going to break the news to his sister-in-law about the death of her husband. His brother's body Ali Baba had put into a sack which the donkey he had been riding now carried. At least his brother would be buried properly and not be left in the cave. Ali Baba had a friend in the house of Cassim. It was Morgiana, the serving maid. She was betrothed to the son of Ali Baba, but they were as yet too poor to wed. It was to this girl that Ali Baba related the terrible story of his brother's death. He asked her to convey the bad news to her mistress and remind her to keep silent about where Cassim had been when he met his untimely end. Morgiana was an intelligent girl and realized immediately what it would mean if the thieves ever discovered that someone else knew of the whereabouts of their treasure cache. She suggested to Ali Baba that Cassim should be buried just as if he had died at home in his own bed. She knew of a craftsman who lived not far away and was very good at sewing leather garments. She would ask him to sew a coat with a tight hood into which the body of Cassim and his head could be fitted. The next day, Cassim was buried. His wife informed the friends of her husband that he had just passed away in his sleep. The ruse was so successful that no one suspected Cassim's wife was lying. That might have been the end of it if Mahmoud and his band of robbers hadn't been back to their hideout. But of course, they had soon collected enough treasure to make the trip to the cave necessary. On entering, there were most surprised to see that the body of Cassim was no longer there. "Someone else knows our secret," shouted Mahmoud. "We must discover without delay who it is. I personally shall cut off the culprit's head." He led his men out of the cave and sent them into the town to mingle with the people and try to discover something useful. It was Mahmoud himself who chanced to meet the man who had made the coat for Cassim to be buried in. "What goes on in this great town of yours?" Mahmoud inquired. "I am not the one to ask," replied the man. "I am far too busy working to notice anything. Why, only last week I was expected to sew a fine coat for a man to be buried in, and I only had one evening to do the job. Everyone is in such a hurry nowadays." Mahmoud was very interested in the coat the man had made. He invited him into the inn for a drink of tea and to hear more about it. The man was quite willing to talk, and before long Mahmoud had gathered all the information that he required. Apparently the man had been blindfolded and taken to the house, where a body was laid out for him to measure for the coat. "I think that the poor devil must have broken his neck," said the fellow. "It did not seem to be in the right position at all, but no matter, I was paid for the job. They gave me 5 gold pieces. "I will double it if you can take me to that house," said Mahmoud, who was now sure that the man could be speaking only of the body of Cassim. The coat maker at first protested that he would be unable to find the house again. The robber chief suggested that if he were blindfolded again, it might prove easier. To this the man finally consented. The man led Mahmoud straight to the house of Ali Baba. On receipt of his 10 coins, he hurried off. Mahmoud stayed behind just long enough to make a chalk mark upon the door. "I shall be back later with my men," he thought. Luckily for Ali Baba, not long after the mark was made, Morgiana noticed it on her way back to the market. She guessed that somehow the thieves had discovered their whereabouts. She hurried into the house for a piece of chalk and then proceeded to mark all the doors in the street in the same way in which Ali Baba's door had been marked. Later that night, in a murderous mood, Mahmoud and his men returned to kill the one who was possessed of their secret. How surprised and angered they were to discover that all the houses in the street were marked with the same sign. Next morning, the coat maker was again persuaded for 5 more gold coins to point out the house to which he had been led. Once again he did so, and Mahmoud made a different mark upon the door. But as luck would have it, Morgiana was again able to help Ali Baba by marking the other doors in the street. For the second time, the robbers were outwitted, and for the last time, the coatmaker pointed out the house. This time, Mahmoud did not rely on chalk marks. Instead, he committed to memory as many details about the house as he was able to remember. Several days later, the robber chief disguised himself as a seller of oil. He prepared 39 huge clay jars, which could be attached to either side of a camel's harness. He ordered his men to climb into the jars and not emerge until ordered to do so. Ali Baba was a very hospitable man. When he heard from the oil merchant about how far he had traveled that day, he invited him to stay and share a meal. The merchant was most happy to do so. Morgiana was sent out to feed the merchant's animals. She was amazed at the sight of so many jars of oil and wondered if she ought to summon a stable boy to feed the camels. She wondered also if the jars were full or empty. She decided to look into one. As she began to raise the lid, a voice spoke from inside the jar. "Is it time yet?" Morgiana was terrified but managed to stammer, "Not yet," in a gruff voice as she could muster. It was clear to Morgiana that the oil seller must be no other than the robber chief. She was equally convinced that the jars contained not oil but thieves. Without delay, she hurried into the kitchen and set a great copper pot on to boil. Time and time again, she filled kettles with the steaming water and carried them out into the courtyard. One by one, she filled the jars with boiling water until all the 39 thieves were dead. In the morning, the oil merchant departed without Morgiana being able to talk to Ali Baba about who his guest was. When he eventually did find out, he was more than grateful to her for her quick thinking. He wanted to give her a reward, a dowry composed of precious stones and gold. Morgiana was very grateful and said that she would be very happy to take the reward and settle down as the wife of Ali Baba's son. But not yet. The robber chief would be sure to return, and this time his revenge would be much worse than before. The words of Morgiana were shortly proved right, for quite soon a new shop opened in the street where Ali Baba lived. The shopkeeper did not in any way resemble the oil merchant, but Morgiana recognized him by the ring he wore. She decided to keep a close watch on the man in case he came to harm the father of her betrothed. Ali Baba was not a suspicious man and soon made friends with the new shopkeeper. He even invited him to dinner. Morgiana watched Mahmoud through the meal, and once as he turned to look at something that Ali Baba pointed out to him, she caught a glimpse of a dagger in his belt. "I would dearly love to dance for our guest," she said. And before Ali Baba could protest, she was on her feet, swirling and turning gracefully and laughing aloud. As she spun around and around, she came nearer and nearer to the guest. Suddenly she turned and plunged a dagger into his chest. Ali Baba was aghast. A guest had been murdered in his own home by the very girl that was to marry his son. He ordered servants to bind her and lead her from the room. Morgiana did not protest, but Ali Baba's son, seeing that his beloved was being unfairly judged, leapt up and confronted his father. "Oh, father," he cried, "do you not realize who this man is? He would have slain you if it were not for the quick thinking of Morgiana." Ali Baba was eventually convinced that his son spoke the truth. He begged Morgiana to forgive him for his unfair judgment of her. "Now you must wed my son," he cried, "and become my own true daughter." Morgiana, of course, agreed. Soon Ali Baba and his wife were able to be present at the wedding of their son to the faithful Morgiana. For a wedding present from Ali Baba, they received 2 words, "Open Sesame," and the instructions on how to reach the treasure cave. This secret was to be theirs alone until they were able to pass it on to their children. And that is the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. I love you. Bye.